Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weebunion, and in this one there are several advances by the Russians all across the front line from the Kursk region in the north into the Sumy region, and in the eastern section of the front line in the Kharkiv region. The Russians have managed to advance in several points. The Russians also managed to advance east of Pokrovsk and to the southwest of the city. The Russians also managed to advance west of Korokhove. Over the past 24 hours, the Russians have made several advances all across the front line, where the Ukrainians have not managed to advance in any of these areas. This continues a trend for the past 3 days, where the Russians have continuously advanced in several sectors of the front line with little to no Ukrainian advances, and this is the fastest rate at which the Russians have been advancing since the start of April. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to reach the outskirts of Bilovody and gain a foothold within the northern parts of the town, as well as to the east of the town. The Russians have here been launching several assaults, both with motorbikes and other vehicles, where they are mostly using smaller groups of infantry to pass through the Ukrainian FPV drones and minefields. The Russians have met with failure to the northwest of Luknia, where their motorbikes were hit by mines, but now they have succeeded in the direction of Bilovody, where several Russian infantrymen managed to get a foothold within the town, where footage shows them getting struck by SPV drones and other drones near the forest patch here in the northwestern parts of the town. Based on this footage, we can see that the Russians have managed to gain access to the town and a foothold within it, and their forward units were attacked near the forest patch area. The Ukrainian units launching these strikes were the 67th Mechanized Brigade, which previously operated in the Serebets River line direction near Terny, where they were fighting against the Russian forces there. They have been rotated to the northern section of the front line to deal with the Russian offensive operations there, which has led to additional advances by the Russians along the Serebets River line due to the weakening of their forces in that direction. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Goranel, as well as reach the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian border. With this, the Russians are only lacking a few forest lines and forest patches at the very outskirts of the region before they regain full control of it, as well as the marsh area. To the east, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the town of Kamyanka, and this is confirmed with the geolocated footage. Based on this, we can see that the Russian Ministry of Defense report was truthful, and if we take that as a basis, we can also see that the Russians have managed to gain control over Doroshivka, as this was reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense today. This indicates that the Russian forces operating across the Uska River line are more truthful than the ones on the eastern bank of it. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are expanding their foothold across the Uska River line, and they're also advancing beyond that of the highway. This is because the Russians do not just need to gain control over the road from the border area all the way to Kupiansk, they also need to secure a buffer zone around it to avoid direct fire on the units operating within the supply roads and the logistical hubs of the Russian forces. Therefore, the Russians are moving in a western direction as well. This is also to gain a foothold here in the town of Munizhenivka and gain control of it, as it is one of the logistical hubs for the Ukrainian forces across the Uska River line. Take a closer look, we can see a lot of the roads goes through this town. There's also the railway that goes through it. If the Russians are able to gain control of the town, they will cut off the northern supply road to Kupiansk, and with control over the highway, the Ukrainians would be limited to much fewer supply routes in a western and southern direction. This will limit the supplies for the Ukrainian forces both on the eastern bank of the Uska River line and within the town of Kupiansk itself. The Russians also managed to advance in the eastern bank of the Uska River line, where they gained full control over Stepova-Novoselivka. They also gained control over the fortified positions to the southwest, where the intersection of the highway and the railway connects. The Russians are here continuing defensive operations and have managed to flatten out the front line here in the west of Svetove. The Russians now are able to redirect their forces to a single point where they can create a new spearhead into Ukrainian positions here in the eastern bank of the Uska River line. The Russians will here look to advance along the railways towards Peshana and fight over the fortified positions there, as well as the highway further north. The objective of the Russians would be to breach the defensive lines and flank them from the rear, where they can launch combined offensive operations from Kozlinegivka to the south, attacking and flanking the fortified positions from the rear, and advancing through towards Pishane and put the fortified positions in a pincer maneuver. The similar case along the highway, all the way towards Petropavlivka, where they can advance from Sqkm in the north, and the highway to the south, flanking the fortified positions in the northern flank. The Russians will likely focus on the southern flank first, as it is further from Kupiansk and other logistical hubs of the Ukrainians, from which much of their FPV drone operators would be operating from. Instead, the Russians will be focusing on this southern flank, gaining control over which will allow them to strengthen offensive operations towards Petropavlivka, and also to face off against the defensive line of the Ukrainians just outside the town of Kupiansk, which is the final defensive line of the Ukrainians on the eastern bank of the river line. The Russians have here isolated the eastern bank of the Kupiansk direction of the Osk River line for many months now. This has limited the supplies for the Ukrainians, especially with the fighting on the western bank of the Osk River line. The Ukrainians are forced to divert the resources over a wider area, and this has allowed the Russians to grind down the Ukrainian defensive capabilities on the eastern bank of the Osk River line. If the Russians have managed to degrade the Ukrainian forces enough on the eastern bank, they'll be able to launch successful operations to gain control of these fortified positions, similar to their success here in between Toretsk and Pokrovsk, where they managed to gain control over significant portions of fortified positions of the Ukrainian positions in between the two cities, where several offensive operations have taken place, and the Russians have met with much success due to the degradation of the Ukrainian defensive capabilities over a long time, limiting the supplies and striking their positions, grinding down their forces. The Russians also managed to advance to the east of Pokrovsk along the highway near the intersection, gaining control over several fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of Berezivka. The Russians have managed to capture Tarasivka and have expanded their operations north and west of Berezivka, gaining control over several fortified positions in the area. The Russians' objective here is to gain control over Novopoltavka. This will allow them to secure a cut-off of the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. It will also allow the Russians to start flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the direction of Konstantinivka, advance further in a western direction along the main roads to expand beyond the highway, and also to attack the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by pincering them from the eastern and western directions through their push towards Myrolyovivka. This would need the Russians to gain control over the town, and the fortified positions here to the south, where they'll be attacking from the eastern and western directions, and then to advance beyond the highway from that direction as well. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are expanding the offensive operations along the highway intersection between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, while also expanding the offensive operations in the central parts between Toretsk and the intersection, as well as within the Toretsk direction. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are intensifying their offensive operations across the entire section of the front line here towards the end of the month. The Russians also managed to advance to the southwest of Pokrovsk, where they continue their advances towards Kotlyarivka. They've advanced on a wide front in the direction of the town and in the area between the town of Kotlyarivka and Troitske. The Russians now have control over the road from Nadiivka all the way towards Kotlyarivka, and they have also managed to cut off one of the roads to the northeast of Kotlyarivka, limiting the supplies to the town from the northern direction. The Russians here are looking to gain control over several supply lines towards the town, to enter it from multiple directions, and to limit the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on the Russian supply lines into the town. Further south, the Russians have also managed to advance in the direction of Behatir from the Rostolny direction, where they continue to advance through the main road, as well as through the forest lines in the direction of the town. The Russians are here looking to slowly advance towards the fortified positions of the town, where they're looking to slowly advance along the forest lines with infantry to dig in closer to the fortified positions and establish a buffer zone in the area, where the Russians with an armored assault can reach the town without direct fire from Ukrainian forces laying in ambush. So this is to clear the first lines of Ukrainian forces ahead of an armored assault towards the town. A similar case happening near Constantinople in the direction of Behatir, where they're looking to clear the highway and the first lines in that direction for an armored assault from the eastern and southern direction at the same time, to gain a foothold within Behatir and to gain control over the fortified position, which will allow them to secure the town. This article from the Wall Street Journal touches upon an important point, and that is that Russia hopes warmer weather will boost flagging spring offensive. hardening ground and increasing foliage could hamper Ukraine's efforts to hold the line. There are 2 points to this headline: the hardening ground and the increasing foliage. The hardening ground is naturally for heavier equipment to advance through the fields rather than the roads. This will allow the Russians to significantly bolster their supply lines, and it will limit the effectiveness of the current Ukrainian strategy, which is to hit the supply lines of the Russian forces. Currently, the Russians are relying on the roads. That means that there are 2 entry points towards Bahatir, while in the summer season, the Russians will be able to advance from any point in these fields, which will significantly bolster their logistical capabilities, and this will allow the Russians to have a much easier time consolidating their positions once they gain access to a town, and this could significantly speed up Russian offensive operations. The second point, which is the increasing foliage, is very important as well, as the current operations where the Russians are moving through the forest lines to advance closer towards these towns. Once the trees have much more leaves on them, it'll provide additional cover for the FPV drones to not detect the Russian forces, and this will allow them to have more success and higher survivability for the infantry moving along these forest lines, as well for vehicles to move through these forest lines. This means that in general, the current Russian offensive operations would be more successful once both of these occur, and this is why the Russians are waiting for the summer season to start larger offensive operations, because larger offensive operations become possible without taking much more casualties than they currently are. The offensive operations during the spring season is much more risky than in the summer period. And usually the summer period in Ukraine starts around May, as we saw last year, where the Russians launched their Kharkiv offensive in the first half of May, and the year before, where the main parts of the Bakhmut battle took place in May, and the Ukrainian summer offensive started in the month of June, very early on. So this means that within the next month, we will likely see the start of a larger offensive operation by the Russians. We may also potentially see a new offensive operation by the Ukrainians. However, it is more likely that the Ukrainians will wait until August or late summer to start their own offensive operation, because in general, the Ukrainians do not have the capacity right now to launch a drawn-out offensive. So similar to last year where they launched their Kursk offensive in the month of August, the objective is to gain as much territory in the shortest amount of time possible, and then hold on until the fall season, where it then becomes much more difficult to launch counterattacks, and this allowed them to hold on to their positions in the Kursk region throughout the whole fall, winter, and the majority of the spring season as well. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.